Hey, Saretsky here. Welcome back to the show. Lots to touch on this week. You might have noticed I missed last week's episode and different location this week. What the hell is going on? Some personal news. I sold my condo probably 2 or 3 months ago. Finally gave the keys over, moving to the new place, doing some renovations. So I've come full circle, currently living at mom's house, like a lot of Canadians these days. So, with that being said, obviously I wanted to let you guys know it'll be kind of touch and go over the next few weeks. Hopefully, have a new studio ready to go by then. But speaking of living in parents' basements, I think this is an incredibly important election coming up, and that's why I wanted to do this week's video is on the election. So I've already had a whole bunch of reporters kind of reach out, hey, we want to interview on election night, talk about housing platforms. Can you be live on the call? And so I kind of wanted to it kind of got to a longer conversation, which I'll kind of walk you through, but it was really interesting, which is to say that there's a lot of things that I'm going to be looking for in this upcoming election. Now, we just chatted with a pollster on the Loonie Hour, Main Street Research, one of the largest polling firms. Basically, every single polling firm in Canada right now is showing you a liberal minority or a liberal majority government come Monday night. Now, the one thing that I found interesting is per Main Street, and this is probably somewhat well known, is to say that polls can be wrong. Polls can be wrong. They had been wrong before. They'll probably be wrong again at some point. I'm not saying that necessarily Monday night they'll be wrong, but if they are going to be wrong, the reason why they're going to be wrong is because a lot of younger people, particularly younger males that don't answer their phones for polling companies, if they go out en masse and vote, and what we're seeing in the numbers today is that young males are leaning to the Conservative Party quite heavily. If you get a lot of young male voters out in numbers, there's a high likelihood of a surprise outcome this election. So I think there's a decent probability of that happening. We'll wait and see. Obviously, it's going to be an interesting Monday night coming up. But I wanted to touch on the fiscal policy announcements from both parties. I want to touch on their housing platforms moving forward and kind of what I think it all means for every one of us listening to this show right here, right now. I've talked about suggesting over the last number of weeks that Canadians should strongly consider locking in their mortgage rates. Yes, the Bank of Canada is likely to cut again this year, given that we're again in a recession. I think the tariff war stuff is sort of escalating, and there's going to be some issues there. But that doesn't mean that fixed rate mortgages come down. And I think we're in a world of uncertainty, not only geopolitically, but there's a lot of uncertainty around policy measures, a lot of uncertainty around debt issuance. But I think one thing is clear that we are likely in that higher for longer period. There's just so much government debt being issued. And that's why we're seeing today, right? Is you're seeing all the volatility in market stocks down, yet bond yields moving higher is the inverse of what they're supposed to do. And I think the big issue here is that there's just too much debt in the world, and we're going to continue to issue more debt, and there's just not enough demand for that debt, and they're demanding higher yields. So again, you could be in a scenario where the Bank of Canada cuts rates and your fixed rate mortgages move higher, which is going to have significant implications for the 60% of Canadians renewing their mortgages over the next 24 months. So, and why do I say I think people should strongly consider locking in their mortgage rates? And again, there might be another opportunity in 6 to 8 months where yields fall and you can lock in. But today, if you ask the right people, you can probably pick up a mortgage today, 5-year fixed at call it 4%. Look at the fiscal platform policies from both governments. Not only the Carney government, but the Pierre Poilievre government both have promised a significant amount of government spending, financed debt issuance spending. Okay, so if we look at the Carney government, remember, we just went through the Trudeau government where they didn't know how to run a budget. There was no budget. They blew past their fiscal anchors. Well, the Carney government, which is supposed to be this brand new government, the Liberals have changed their stripes. Apparently not if you look at what they're proposing. They are proposing over the next 4 years to run a $224 billion deficit. That's nearly double what Trudeau would have or was projected to run on. So they're going to run a $224 billion deficit. Now, again, they're saying, well, these are investments in the economy. I mean, where have we heard that story before? At the end of the day, debt is debt. these investments will be financed through government debt issuance, $224 billion. Now, again, keep that in mind. The Pierre Poilievre government is not necessarily that much better. What they are projecting right now is they're projecting $100 billion. So approximately half of what Carney is. That's significant, but it's still $100 billion. Now, the team at Scotiabank Economics basically took both party platforms and they ran the numbers and they ran their assumptions and they basically analyzed and they said, listen, well, both parties fiscal sort of budgets are not good. Okay, they're both bad, but one is worse than the other, and the Carney government's is clearly worse at 224 billion. You'll notice there's a piece where it says Pierre Poilievre without the dynamic revenue, which basically the dynamic revenue means the Pierre Poilievre sort of platform is really predicated on a lot of like deregulation and tax cuts. And the idea is through deregulation and tax cuts is that it will create and generate more growth. And so Scotiabank is saying, well, if maybe all that deregulation and maybe all those tax cuts don't actually generate any real growth, if they don't, then the budget deficit will be more like 156 billion. So, but even under that circumstance, of course, it's still quite a bit lighter than what Carney has proposed. So that's number one. Now, again, keep in mind of whatever government you support, the writing is on the wall. They're telling you what they're going to do. They're going to blow a massive fiscal bazooka, the likes of which we have not seen in a very long time. I mean, this looks again almost larger. I mean, not quite as large, but these are massive, massive fiscal spending programs that are being planned. And again, these will probably be, I would argue, even worse because most of these sort of projections and budgets are based on relatively rosy outcomes, relatively rosy picture on the economy side. But again, if you get like a deeper prolonged recession, you could be looking at a scenario where revenues drop off significantly and that deficit blows out even further, which I think is almost certain to happen. So keep that in mind as you're shopping for your mortgage rates. Now, on the housing side, I had a CBC reporter. She calls me up and she says, I'd like to have you, available on Monday night for the elections. She goes on to interview me for about 20 minutes to make sure I sort of, I guess, pass their, credentials checks or what they want to hear. And I gave her, I tried to be as objective about it as possible. And she's asked me, who you voting for and what do you think about the housing platforms? And I said, listen, the reality is both of these parties' housing platforms are really not going, in my opinion, not really going to move the needle. There's actually the only thing I'll give Trudeau credit for. He was kind of right when he said the federal government doesn't really have that large a role to play in housing. And he's true because on a micro level, housing policy is largely set at the provincial and the municipal levels. But where Trudeau was wrong is that you can actually have a massive influence on housing through other policy measures. And the biggest one, of course, was immigration. It was the biggest fumble that we've seen in I would say modern history policymaking was allowing 1.2 million people a year for several years to come into this country with no ability to really ramp up housing and nowhere for these people to live. We were already in a severe housing crunch at the time. And so what the mistake that they made is the government that is actually going to do the most for housing is the government that's going to run a proper economy, the government that is going to create economic opportunity. They're going to create strong jobs. They're going to create wage growth that hopefully surpasses and outpaces the price appreciation of housing. That's how you get more affordable housing over time, is you have strong wage growth and productivity, which allows you to basically afford a house. And obviously having sensible immigration policies. So the biggest thing I can say to voters is it's less so about the little details here about, you got a housing accelerator fund and we're going to cut the GST off housing. Yeah, sure. Those are nice little things that, help around the edges. But in terms of like big picture stuff, it's going to be sensible immigration and running a stable economy. If the Canadian economy, has productive capacity, it has opportunities to invest just outside of housing, people won't be feel compelled to have to plow all their money into housing and speculate on higher house prices. And so, if you can create a more well balanced economy, I actually think you take a lot of the pressure off housing through that void. And that was obviously what I was trying to emphasize in my conversation with the CBC. So, that's what I ultimately think. Now, if you want to get into the micro of housing policies, we can certainly get into them. There's a good site called buildcanada.com, and you can actually go in and type housing, and you'll be able to see every single promise that both of these party leaders have made throughout their election campaign. But essentially, what we have here is sort of the big ones, of course. On the conservative side, is removing GST on new housing. So I think it's up to 1.3 million. They're going to remove GST on that. That makes new construction more competitive. We know what's happening in the new construction space. It is rolling over. You can't. New construction is no longer competitive with the resale market, and so you're not basically launching new projects to sell, and you actually are sowing the seeds, in my opinion, for the next next housing upcycle in probably 3 to 4 years from now. They're going to temporarily lower immigration. They're going to basically what they're trying to do is they're going to say go to the cities and say, um, if you permit 15% more homes, we will give you more infrastructure money. If you don't, we will pull back your infrastructure money. So it's a little bit of a different sort of take than I guess what the liberals have done, particularly with the housing accelerator fund, is they basically just said, "We'll change your zoning, then we'll give you the money. As soon as you change your zoning, we'll give you the money." But what happened was all these cities were saying, "Okay, we changed our zoning, give us the money." The federal government would stroke the check, they take the check, cash the check, and then when they would go and raise their development fees to basically make these zoning changes non-viable, which is to say you can upzone all the land you want, but if you make it uneconomical to build on, it doesn't get built. So that's essentially what was happening in places where I'm close to, in places like Burnaby, where they changed a whole bunch of their zoning, and then they raised development charges by roughly $50,000 on new condo units, which is a staggering amount, $50,000 extra, which of course removes the viability of these projects. Now, the Liberal government has also promised to build. Um, they've promised to build sort of more social housing. I mean, both governments are basically promising to build on federal land. The conservative side saying, listen, we'll just take the land, we'll sell it off to a private developer, and the private developer can go build, let the private sector go and do what they need to do. Whereas the liberal Carney side is saying, we are going to basically take our land, partner with the private sector. They'll build it, and we'll just basically hold it as essentially social housing. This housing won't be sold. It will basically be sort of government socialized housing. So it kind of depends on your economic or your political ideology about how you think about housing. Do you think that the government should run and control all of it, or do you think that should be left sort of more to the private sector, private market? And those are kind of the differences of ideology in the two policies. Of course, I believe that government, when involved, I think government has been too involved in housing, and that's why you have all this regulation, red tape, where it takes 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 years to get a permit for a new apartment building, is because of all the hurdles that you have to jump through. So, my sort of own political views is that I think you should have less government in in housing. They should be getting out of the way and streamlining it. And so, I just look at this because as someone that is active in the Vancouver real estate market as well as the Calgary, Alberta market, I can tell you getting permits and building in Alberta is way easier than what we see in places like Vancouver, BC. So, um, the one thing I'll give the Liberals side on is they've introduced, where I kind of like, is they've introduced MERB. It's the multi-unit residential building. Essentially, what it is like a tax incentive. It's particularly for like higher net worth people, where basically they can depreciate more of the building up front. So if you go and build a rental apartment building, you can depreciate more of it up front, and then you can actually use the losses on the rental income side to lower your personal taxes. And so that was a very successful program in the 1970s. It actually ended up getting overused and abused, where basically people started building almost sort of shoddy buildings just to get the tax credits and lower their tax bill. But again, if you want a whole bunch of housing, probably not the worst idea, at least in the near term. Short term, um, yeah, again, one other thing on the Carney side, looking at this is they've talked about um, $25 billion, I believe, to prefab home technology and basically trying to essentially cut checks into that industry to get them to basically launch this at scale. I can tell you guys, I've chatted with people that are in prefab. I know people that are trying to sort of grow it and scale it. It it's far away. It's actually not any cheaper today to build prefab. So it's not cheaper today. What it does is actually saves on your construction timeline. Should you typically shave off 3 months roughly on, let's say, a single family house, which is not insignificant. I mean, you think about the holding costs that are involved, the money you save during those 3 months, it makes a difference. But make no mistake, given again, each city's municipal zoning bylaws, codes, building codes at the provincial levels, scaling up prefab housing. This is not an overnight solution. This is going to be a decade plus in the making. So again, I think it's kind of an irrelevant policy and right here, right now, which is what most Canadians, I think about, care about. So long story short, that's kind of my views on the upcoming election, the housing policy stuff. Again, these governments are all making the same promises. We're going to build 500,000 homes. All bullshit. The record that we've ever built in this country is back in the 1970s. We built 276,000 homes. So we're now in an economic downturn. Housing is no longer economically viable in many circumstances. New housing is not getting built, period, full stop. 30-year lows in the GTA for new home sales. And if you can't generate new home sales, you don't get construction to build the housing. So the fact that you were saying, well, we're going to build 500,000 homes per year for the next 4 or 5 years, never going to happen. Again, even if we had the right economic conditions, we've never surpassed 276,000. So I am very, very not skeptical. I mean, it's an outright lie that we're going to hit anywhere close to 500,000, whether it's the Liberal government in power or the Conservative government in power. What we know for sure, as we talk about on this channel, is that new housing is going to roll off a cliff hard over the next 24 months. That will eventually sow the seeds for your next upcycle. But an important election coming up. I think the biggest thing that the government can do at the federal level is to have sensible immigration. Yes, you can, carrot and stick approach to the provinces and to the municipalities, but it can only go so far. So you need to have sensible immigration. You need to run a prosperous economy where people have jobs, wage growth, and that all feeds through into helping people obtain housing and obviously pay for the rent. So I think that's the biggest takeaway that I have. I'll be watching the election night. I'm sure we'll chat about it next week with the results. I hope that helped, and we'll see you next week.